Number 15. My apologies for the length of this story. I have tried to cut it down some, but it is simply a long story. I'm hoping this is vague enough to remain anonymous because those involved are still out there somewhere and I'd really prefer to not encounter them again. However, I will say that this story happened in the USA. For reference, I was 20 years old at the time, living in an apartment with my mom and little brother while I attended community college. When we first moved in, the apartments were very well run, but within a short time the managers were transferred elsewhere, and his replacement did not have his skill at keeping undesirable types of people out. The police became a regular sight in our neighborhood, and it was rare a day would go by without seeing them. The woman who moved in downstairs from us began openly dealing drugs. People would come and go at all hours and leave, stuffing little bags of various substances into their pockets. Mostly weed, but definitely other stuff as well. They could not have been more obvious if they tried. And there was always a crowd of shady-looking men with large, unfriendly dogs hanging around the yard or even sitting on our stairs. They'd act like it was a personal insult if we interrupted them to walk up or down the stairs and would just generally be quite intimidating. The breaking point didn't come until their customers started getting the wrong address and coming to our door instead. We'd be sitting in the living room and hear footsteps come up the stairs and the doorknob would turn and jiggle against the lock. We became religious about keeping the door locked tight. One night, I was home alone and somebody started just beating on the door. Not knocking, it was more like he thought it was a punching bag, all the while screaming barely comprehensible obscenities. I grabbed the biggest butcher knife out of the kitchen and shouted through the door that I was calling 911 and he ran away. In hindsight, I probably should have actually called, but I was just relieved he was gone, and since I hadn't seen what he looked like at all, I just figured it wouldn't be much use. After that, though, I always pushed the couch in front of the door before I went to bed. My mom had had enough at this point. She tried going to the manager first and was met with a total lack of interest from her. So she decided there was nothing to be done but contact the police about it herself. So she called about it, and she got off the phone looking happy because they at least seemed to take her seriously and promised to investigate. The first sign of trouble came the next night. There was a lot of thumping and bumping downstairs, and a peek out of the window showed people going in and out of the apartment carrying cardboard boxes to a dented van on the street. Bright and early the next morning, the police raided the place and, you guessed it, clean as a whistle. At first, we didn't realize the implication of this. When it started back up again a few days later, my mom called the cops again, and the same thing happened. At this point, we realized it probably wasn't a coincidence. Somebody in the local police department was most likely tipping them off. One of the curses of a small town. I was angry and disappointed, but at least we tried, right? It never hurt to try. I wish. About a week later, I was getting ready for an evening class. I had just gotten out of the shower and I was in my bedroom in a bathrobe picking out what I wanted to wear. I heard a loud banging on the front door, but I didn't think much of it. We'd been expecting a package and the UPS man always knocked loudly. My mom's footsteps went to answer it and I hear her say something. I couldn't make out the words, but her tone caught my attention and I felt like something was wrong. I reached for my door, but before I could open it, it flew open in my face. All my shocked brain could grasp was, huge man with a gun in my room, before I was grabbed by the shoulders and flung to the floor. I honestly thought the druggies downstairs had come to get us once and for all. I thought I was going to be raped and murdered. At this point, I should mention I'd had an issue with one of my wrists for years due to a childhood injury. I'd had it operated on twice, and this was not more than a few months after the second operation. Naturally, I managed to land with my full weight on that wrist, and something crunched horribly. I did what any tough person would do, and immediately burst into tears and sat there clutching my wrist, waiting to die. I guess I must not have looked very threatening like that, because he stepped back a little bit. And that's when I saw police on the front of his vest. The next few minutes were a bit of a blur. Somehow, I was herded out into my living room where my mom was, and the cop left without saying more than, "Wait here." I was completely dazed. My mom was pretty much having hysterics, and there was all kinds of shouting and activity going on outside. After a short while, the cop returned and informed us, to paraphrase, "Sorry, wrong address. Shit happens, we can't be perfect all the time. My name is Officer Shinkin, here's my card, and you can call if you have any questions." And then he just left. I went straight to the emergency room and spent the next 2 hours getting my wrist x-rayed and put into a splint. And then I went to math class because, I didn't know what else to do, and I was terrified of being at home. Needless to say, I learned nothing whatsoever, but the support of my teacher and classmates was reassuring. The next morning, somebody knocked on the door. When my mom answered, it was Officer Shinkin again. When I heard his voice, I started hyperventilating and went to hide in the bathroom. So, I didn't hear what was said, but I heard when my mom slammed the door. She was absolutely furious. I had never seen her look so angry. Apparently, good old Officer Shinkin had brought along a carefully prepared document that he wished for us to sign. It basically said we understood that it was all a terrible mistake and that we would not be seeking legal action. She told him to go to hell and shut the door in his face. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was one of the nurses at the emergency room saying somebody claiming to be law enforcement had just come by trying to get copies of my emergency room visit records. But they didn't have permission to release those, and if I wanted him to have them, I'd have to come by and sign the forms. Oh hell no! Further questions revealed that yes, the man matched Officer Shinkin's description, and furthermore, he had told the nurse that he was not the officer involved, but was investigating the incident. I started to find that pretty much everyone that I told my story to would get a funny look on their face and say, "This cop, was his name Officer Shinkin?" And then they would launch into their own horror story about him. My high school teacher said that he shot one of her former students during a marijuana bust and left him on the ground to bleed to death. But the other officer on the scene did first aid and saved his life. One of our neighbors said he dragged said neighbor's disabled uncle down a flight of stairs by his feet, hitting his head on every concrete step. Another neighbor said Officer Shinkin pulled him out of the shower by his hair and held a gun to his head over a parole violation. And Google said he'd once been fired from a nearby city for shooting a handcuffed man in the head, killing him. He claimed it was somehow self-defense and was fired, but never charged with any crime. The medical bills for the ER visit ended up being over $7 grand, and I didn't have insurance, so basically I had no choice but to file a suit. I found myself a lawyer and submitted a claim, and that's when shit really hit the fan. We started getting disturbing phone calls at all hours of the night. Sometimes just silence at the other end or the sound of somebody breathing, and sometimes graphically sexual comments. When we stopped answering the phone, they just let it ring until the machine picked up, then immediately hung up and then did it again. My mom went to her car one morning and opened the door, only to discover the handle had been coated in some kind of caustic chemical. She washed it off quickly, but still ended up with burns and an emergency room visit. I'd just gotten my permit and I was out for driving practice when it began to rain as I went down the highway. I flipped on the windshield wipers and discovered they'd been coated with grimy motor oil. It smeared across the windshield and completely obscured my vision. Fortunately, the road was empty enough I was able to slam the brakes and pull to the side without getting in an accident. Other things started happening too. Less severe but sinister given the context above. Somebody cut out a bunch of metal malicious skull designs and tacked them to our wall or pushed them under the door at night. What the fuck? I still have no idea what that was supposed to accomplish. Furniture was stolen off the porch, my boots vanished when I left them out there, and oddly, several pounds of weed in a plastic sack appeared on our porch one morning. My mom called the manager to get it without going outside. For once in her life, the lady did something useful and actually fetched it and threw it in the dumpster. I have never felt so helpless in my life. What was I gonna do? Call the police? It was around this time that a friend who lived abroad suggested I come stay with him for a while for my own safety. I dropped out of school and left the country for 6 months while the lawsuit worked its way through the courts. My mother and brother moved in with family and then to another town without submitting a forwarding address. Eventually, my tourist visa ran out and I had to come home. I was a complete nervous wreck and I ended up settling out of court for a relatively small sum of money just to make it over. My lawyer got a copy of the search warrant they'd used. It was riddled with grammatical errors and switched my apartment number, 18, and the number of the unit down the street, 25, at random. The suspect was somebody with an entirely different name, who looked entirely different from any of us, and who apparently sold some OxyContin pills. She lived in Unit 25. I saw a copy of her driver's license. It said right on the front of it, in nice clear letters, Unit 25 as her address. I don't know, I have no proof, but it was obvious that somebody had been tipping off our drug dealers downstairs, and I often wonder if the wrong number on that warrant was not a mistake at all. Perhaps it was meant as a retaliation for trying to get their friends in trouble. I've now regained full use of my hand, which my doctor had told me might never happen. I no longer have a heart attack at loud noises, and I only feel slightly uneasy when I see police uniforms rather than having full-on panic attacks. It's 6 years later, and I'm only now beginning to reclaim my life, kick the PTSD, and going back to finish school. I feel like I lost the best part of my 20s to these jerks, and I'm still bitter about it. I currently live with friends in an informal situation. My real address is not on any documentation and I get all my mail in a PO box in another town. Depending on which document you're looking at, I supposedly live in 5 different places scattered from one end of the county to another. And I'm not going to change that until I move a lot further away from where all this happened. As far as I know, nobody involved ever faced any sort of consequences.
Number 14. A few years ago, I was at one of the lowest points in my life. My wife had left me, so I was alone, heartbroken, and depressed. I don't have many friends, so I had nowhere to go. I would just walk around stores for hours, so I wouldn't have to be home alone by myself, thinking about how shitty my life was. I very nearly committed suicide on more than one occasion, but somehow talked myself out of it. During this time, I happened across an adult webcam site that I would hang out on, not only for the obvious reason, but also because you could actually chat with people. Eventually, I started broadcasting myself. If you've never been on one of these sites, think Twitch but with nudity. People can view your cam, tip you, and subscribe to be notified when you're online. I didn't have many people in my room at first, but eventually, I started to get a few anonymous viewers, and it was kind of exciting that someone was watching me. Before long, I was up to dozens of viewers and a few subscribers. I even started getting some tips and making a little money doing something that, let's face it, I'd be doing every evening anyway. It was mostly guys watching me, of course, but even though I'm straight, it didn't bother me too much. It gave me people to talk to at least. From time to time, however, I would get females, or at least guys saying they were female. Eventually, a girl named Britt started stopping by regularly. She was different from most of the people I had met on the site, because she actually seemed interested in talking to me, and I, of course, enjoyed the attention. Whenever she'd stop by, the whole room would become a lot more fun. We started private messaging, and I even made her a moderator for my room. She asked me if I had Kik, which at the time I had never heard of. But she explained that it was a texting app that you didn't have to give out your number to use. So we started chatting offline using it. We would talk for hours. I found out that she lived halfway across the country, which I actually liked because there was no pressure to meet in person right away. We sent pictures, and she was very attractive. and at some point we began sexting one another. Even though I doubted much would ever really come of it, it was great for me, because it gave me someone to talk to, and it was really helping me rebuild my shattered self-esteem and confidence. This went on for a few months, and eventually, we started talking less and less. I had kind of expected that this wasn't going to go anywhere, so it didn't bother me when she stopped responding altogether. I had never held any illusions that this was going to be some long-term relationship. I figured that she found someone real near her, and decided that someone she could actually be with was better than a long-distance fling with someone she had never even met in person. It was fine. By this point I had met a few girls myself, so I wasn't too upset. I did miss chatting with her sometimes, because I had really enjoyed talking to her, and she'd been there for me during a pretty dark time. Anyway, I went on with my life and started dating someone, and we ended up going on a trip to a beach together. A couple of days after I got back, I got a message from Brit asking if I was in Florida. What the fuck? How would she have known I was in Florida? I said no, but that I had been there last week. She said that she was there now, and we must have just missed each other. We talked for a bit, and she asked me where I had stayed, and told me she was just down the street from that hotel. When I told her that I had been there with someone, she got pretty upset, and then stopped messaging me again. I was a little confused, and more than a little weirded out that she had known where I was, but I didn't think too much of it. I told myself it must have just been a strange coincidence, and I forgot all about it. Then, things took a turn for the worse. A few weeks later, I get another message from Brit, late at night, after my girlfriend had gone to sleep. It said, "Who the fuck is she?" I had no idea how to respond. I asked her what the fuck she was talking about, and she went on to describe my girlfriend and asked me why I thought I could get away with cheating on her. I was literally floored. Not only had I never been in an actual relationship with Brit, I had never even met her in person. On top of that, she had stopped speaking to me for months, and now suddenly knew what my girlfriend looked like, and was accusing me of cheating on her. I expressed all of this to her, and then asked her how she knew what my girlfriend looked like, thinking she was Facebook stalking me or something. Her reply made my jaw drop, and felt like someone had just tossed a brick into the pit of my stomach. "Because I can see her in your fucking bed." I immediately closed the blinds and checked the house, and made sure the doors and windows were locked. I told her that we had never been in a relationship, and that we were most definitely not in one now. I asked her to please leave me alone and not contact me ever again. She just responded, "Lol," and a smiley face. It was at this point that I noticed the light on my webcam was on. She had somehow hacked into my computer and turned my fucking webcam on. I unplugged it and threw it in the closet. Brit then sent me another message. "Oh, you're no fun anymore." I reiterated that this was unacceptable, that I didn't want to talk to her again, and that if she didn't leave me alone, I would contact the police. Then I blocked her from every form of communication I have ever used, and uninstalled Kik. The next day, I had my cable company change my IP address, and I haven't heard from her since. But I'm still paranoid that this isn't over.
Number 13. To start out, this story sort of takes place on and off again throughout most of my life. It starts out as a typical, my parents got a divorce when I was young situation, but it unfolded into so much more. In fact, I'm still picking up pieces of everything that happened. Just a warning, there's a lot of backstory that I feel is important to understanding what happened. As it stands now, my father is dead. It was ruled a suicide, but I think that was only half of what happened. I'll talk about everything that led up to this, but more importantly, I believe that Mary definitely had a hand in what happened. My mother and father divorced when I was around 4. Almost everyone I know has gone through some sort of similar situation. I have 2 brothers, one older and one younger. We saw him every other weekend. He paid child support. You get the gist. One weekend visit, my father introduces us to a woman he's seeing, named Mary. Her eyes and hair are dark, and her skin is pale. She had an obsession with the color red. Something was immediately off to me, but I didn't really start to know what she was capable of until later. My mother hated her, but she never badmouthed my father or Mary in front of my brothers and I. She felt that it was important for us to make judgments for ourselves, even if this woman was part of the reason her marriage was broken up. We continued to visit what was now Dad and Mary's house on our scheduled time with Dad. I always associated their house with red. Their house was always decorated with strawberries. Mary liked red sheets, and she had red sweaters and pants. It was weird. Mary was just unnecessary drama for a while. Things like buying us toys that we could only keep at Dad's and Mary's house, or saying that she and my father wanted to get custody of us instead of my mom. I feel like these things were harmless in a way. Every divorcing couple probably has some sort of variation. Things carried on like this for a couple of years. We would have a special variation of Christmas or Easter or whatever aside from what we celebrated with my mom. I was about 7 or 8 when I remembered the first incident that confirmed I knew this wasn't right. My little brother was a super curious child, and he was about 4. He had scooted a dining table chair to the fridge to get a cereal box on top, and when he reached up, he pulled down a handgun instead of a box of cereal. I panicked and got my dad, who acted really funny about it. My memory is fuzzy, but I remember going home early that weekend. My dad didn't know the gun was there, because it was Mary's. It was at this point that my mom started having trouble with us going over there. My father got worse about being able to come pick us up. He was unreliable for the most part to begin with, but I know that he was 10 times worse when he was around Mary. My mom told me later, when I was much older, that Mary called her house around the time of the gun incident and said, "I want your life." My mother is a really tough lady. She grew up in East LA in California, and this scared her. She was going to get a restraining order soon. I guess what Mary meant was that she wanted my mom's stability. Even as a single mom with 3 kids, she was doing very well for herself, and even dating. But even so, how long had she been obsessed with my mom before she and my father even got divorced? What did that even mean? Not long after the phone call, my mom heard her car being smashed into one night. Someone had taken a brick and smashed the driver window. Nothing was taken. I know it was Mary. We had no way to prove it, but I just know. My dad and Mary had a baby. Her name is Madison. I only remember holding or playing with her for so long. I can't imagine all the shit she's been through. My mom met and married my stepdad pretty soon after that, and they decided that it would be best to move to Florida. We had other family there, and there weren't many jobs where we were living in Tennessee. I don't remember any problems at all when we were so far from my dad and Mary. We stayed for about a year, and then we moved back to Tennessee. My stepdad was able to get a better job again, and we were closer to my mom's parents. This is when the phone calls start. As soon as we moved back, we would get phone calls where someone would just listen for a few minutes, and then hang up. The numbers were always blocked, but I'm sure it was her. She always knew where we lived, because we started seeing my dad again. The calls continued for years. It became like an inside joke. We all knew who it was, but there wasn't anything we could do. My father denied it. Anytime I asked him about it, he took her side. We fell into this thing where my mom was the bad guy, and anytime I questioned my dad and Mary's behavior, they were sure my mom was putting me up to it. Things escalated one night when my dad came to pick us up for a visit. My mom and Mary ended up getting into a fist fight, where Mary swung her fist, and my mom punched her so hard she fell backward. My brothers and I watched from the apartment we were living in at the time. Mom went immediately to the police, but my dad and Mary never even called. My mom didn't press any charges, and the whole incident sort of faded away. We ended up moving into a big house a while after that, where we still are today. Dad and Mary started to have problems and split up. I thought maybe she would be gone for good, or at least gone for the most part, but she never really went away. My dad started to become a person we could somewhat rely on again when she was gone. I got to know my little sister more, the baby they had, and things were okay. She started coming around again, though. Whenever she was with my dad in front of us, she would whisper in his ear. My dad would drink more. He became physically ill-looking and would start to gain weight. We could always tell when Mary was around because the difference was so drastic. He even officially divorced her at one point, but it was obvious that they still got together off and on. My brothers and I went on with our lives, and we became too old for visiting the way we were. Whole weekend visits became just going to see my dad for an evening. The whole time, however, the phone calls never stopped. They weren't as frequent, but they were there in the background, like a reminder that she was always there lurking. When I got into high school, visits from my dad just about stopped altogether. We usually talked on the phone here and there, and I saw him when I had events like a marching band competition, a formal dance, milestone, like graduating high school. It was pretty common to go a while without hearing from him sometime. Mary was only a thought. I hadn't seen her in years. I never saw her anywhere, at all. The phone calls had stopped, but only because we had gotten rid of the house phone. I was a freshman in college, and I remember it being right around Halloween of 2009. I was shopping with my aunt for some cheap decorations at the Walmart by my house. I saw a woman walking slowly behind us, and my aunt and I both did a double take. It was Mary. She was totally following us around the store. She looked like she was maybe 50 years older than when I saw her last, and her clothes were disheveled. My aunt kept elbowing me to go talk to her because we weren't exactly sure if this was really her. It could have been someone who just looked really similar. I worked up the nerve and went up to her. "Is your name Mary?" I asked. "Yes, it is. Hi, Sam. How are you?" Using my name like that really caught me off guard. She knew who I was and wasn't bothered to talk to me. She didn't even act like she was being caught. I asked her if she had talked to my dad lately because it had been a while since I heard from him. She swore up and down she hadn't spoken to him for months, which I later found out was a lie. This was the beginning of my dad going missing. After I saw her, something happened, and it's hard to pin down what, but he completely disappeared. His cell phone was shut off, and when I called his work at the casino, where he had been working for 15 years, they said he was no longer working there and couldn't tell me why. My mom and brothers and I called the police to file a missing persons report. We didn't have to wait because it had already been several weeks since we had heard from him, and we looked and asked all over. Everything led back to Mary most likely being the last one to see him. By the time we started talking to her, it was mid-November. My mom and I called Mary, and she would tell us that she, in fact, had seen my dad on the night after Halloween. Mary told us that he was making a noose, and this would be the last time anyone ever saw him. We honestly didn't know what to believe. My dad was an alcoholic. It wasn't uncommon for him to say drastic stuff, but we never considered suicide. When we told the detectives what Mary told us, they had her come in for questioning. She had told the detectives a completely different story, and her dates kept changing. There wasn't any evidence of anything though, so there wasn't much they could do. The detectives did, however, tell us that we shouldn't talk to her anymore. To quote them, "We don't know what she's capable of." Things went on like this until they found him on January 4th, 2010. My dad was found dead in a storage unit. He had pulled his car in, shut the unit door, and let it run until he died. And he had been there for 63 days. There were several suicide notes, all dated from November 2nd, one for my mom and one for each of his children. But there was an especially long note for Mary, where he doted her and talked about what a wonderful woman she was. The suicide note even said for her to take any insurance money and use it on herself. The date on the notes was so close to the date where Mary said she had seen him that there was a million things that could have happened. But I know that she had something to do with it. Even if my father really did kill himself, I know that she helped push him over the edge. I'm not one to just blame someone. I know my father's a troubled man. He was an alcoholic, and he was a depressant most of the time, usually because of Mary. But there's something so frustrating and horrendous about this woman, and there's zero evidence for me to prove anything against her. She wasn't allowed to come to the funeral. My mom and parts of his family put everything together. There wasn't anyone he knew that hadn't heard of her, and everyone felt that she was a bad woman. I found a Facebook profile of her months after they found my dad. There were only 5 or 6 photos of her and some guy, obviously happy, and they were all dated for January 4th, 2010. The next year, on January 4th, 2011, she showed up at my family's house. We didn't let her in the house, and she kept saying something about having some stuff of my dad's in the car. We told her to leave, or else we would call the police. That night, someone put red tissue paper in and around our mailbox. Even the next year, 2012, she called my mom and asked her to meet her in a Sonic Burger parking lot. She said she had a box of my dad's stuff to give us. My mom made my stepdad go instead of her, but she never showed. I feel like she wanted to do something bad to my mom. The next year, we didn't hear from her. I did some research, and it turns out that she was put in jail for making meth. It made a lot more sense for some of the things, but I still have so many questions and issues that are unanswered. Supposedly, she was let out sometime last year, summer of 2014, I think, and it says that she was let out for good behavior and rehab. I found a different Facebook that showed her with some other family. God help them if she's pulling the same crap as she did with mine. Today, I have no idea where she is.
Number 12. Former Air Force here. I was a munitions systems technician, and I worked in a very large storage facility called a bomb dump in Europe. This place had dozens of buildings, including many earth-covered magazines called igloos, housing thousands of bombs. This facility was pretty big. It was about 9 square miles, I think. An interesting thing about this bomb dump was that it was completely forested and populated with wildlife. Most are deforested because of the fire hazards, but the country that this bomb dump was in required that the area be maintained as a natural preserve. Now, despite having a small deer population, this forest wasn't nice and clear. Most forests have a fire or two to clear them out every 20 years or so. This forest had played host to munition storage since World War II and had no fire since. It was thick, dark, and dank. The trees were so overgrown that you would be hard-pressed to see 10 yards in a straight line. Anyway, it was a pretty creepy place at night. Hell, it was pretty creepy in the daytime. Twice a day, we had to run a security check to make sure that no holes had been cut through the fence, and all of the buildings were closed and locked. However, this wasn't the job of the swing shifters. We were a skeleton crew. The checks were run by the morning and afternoon crews, unless of course they fucked up, which they did one afternoon. The one guy in control doesn't realise that no PM security check was run until about 1 AM. Since no one is working dispatch, he just walks down the hall to our office and asks us to run it. We had finished all of our work early, so we were planning to split screen Halo, which was new at the time. My friend and I, Brian, volunteered to take a truck out and run the check. We grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight, and then we headed out. First we run the perimeter. It's about an 11 or 12 mile trip, but we have to go about 15 miles per hour tops, so it takes quite a while. When we started building checks, it was about 2 AM. We began at the back. I can't remember how it went now, but we had an efficient system for checking every building without having to double back. Anyway, we started as far back from our building and co-workers as possible. Well, Brian decides that a piss and a cigarette are in order before we begin the building check, which would take us another hour or so. He shuts the truck off, drops the tailgate, and we just sit and chill in utter darkness, while he burns down his cig. To this day, I don't know why we shut the ignition off. When we hopped back in and tried to start the truck again, nothing happened. The ignition simply didn't fire. No attempted turnover, no splutter and fail, just silence. It must have been an electrical problem. Well, fuck. We both thought it and said it simultaneously. Control, this is Storage 1. We're broken down here. Control, we're out past Building 70. We need a ride. Do you copy? We tried the walkie-talkie for a good 15 minutes before we realised that we would be walking back. Now, we could have stuck to the road. There were no streetlights, but at least we would know where we were going. We would have to walk about a mile northward to the main corridor and turn east for another 3 miles. Not too bad, but for some reason we thought it would be much faster to take a shortcut through the forest. I actually knew this was a shitty idea, but I had a man card to preserve, so I went along with the idea. No matter what logical idea I came up with for sticking to the road, it always sounded like I'm a giant pussy when I said it in my head. So I trudged out into the woods with Brian. You'd think that Brian had balls of steel. You'd think that he would shrug off any spooky shit just to save some face. This was all his testosterone-laden idea anyway, after all. Well, this wasn't so. Brian was scared shitless about 10 minutes in. Now, I wasn't too scared. I knew it was a bad idea, but I wasn't about to lose it or anything. However, Brian's anxiety was strong, and I could sense it. And worst of all, it was getting increasingly contagious. Walking through thick woods is slow, and our cell phones were back in our lockers. Before, we just went off of the clock in the truck, but that truck was a quarter mile away now, so we had no real idea what time it was, but we were too far into the woods to go back. I knew that we weren't going in a straight line. We were meandering about, but I did know that we should have almost been to one of the rows of the buildings. It was probably only about 20 minutes since we had left the truck, but it might as well have been hours when we reached the row of the buildings. These were old buildings, above ground brick structures, not the concrete igloos. The above ground magazines had specially designed roofs that would blow upwards in the event of a catastrophic explosion, minimizing damage to nearby structures. They were also some of the oldest buildings in the bomb dump, little newer than the World War II itself. They were ramshacked, rusted and coated in moss. Inside, they were dank and mouldy. The only thing we kept in them were plain Mk82 bomb bodies, the least expensive and the least sensitive stock that we had. The only saving grace about these buildings was the dim industrial lights over their doorways. While not ideal, the soft orange glow was a welcome break from our flashlight. We started walking down the gravel road that these buildings lined. We passed one, then another, and another. Then, holy fucking shit, Joe. One of the buildings was open, The big steel blast doors were sealed, but the side door for personnel to use was popped open with a fucking rock. Control, this is storage 1. Building 62 is not secure. Did you get that, Control? Building 62 is open. I looked at Brian. You know, we have to check this out, right? Though it was too dark to tell, I'm pretty sure Brian went a little pale. Yep. We approached the door like Osama bin Laden was going to jump out with a fucking scimitar and gut us. After all, we didn't have weapons on us. I stuck my head in. Hello? I felt a chill over me as I entered. Brian followed. It stunk in the building. It smelled like wet concrete and mildew. I shined the flashlight down a row of bombs. There were hundreds in there. When I was satisfied, we headed back to the doorway. We didn't have the keys to lock it up, but at least we could say that it was secure. That's when I heard it. The most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. My heart went into my fucking throat. Brian just ran. I just followed him. We ran all the way out of the building, across the road and into the trees across. What the fuck? Brian was shaking. I'm pretty sure that I was too.
This took place 4 years ago when I was a new nurse. I'll take a moment to explain what my job was like. On evenings, nights, and weekends, there is a phone number that people can call and ask for medical advice, and if needed, a nurse can be sent out to have a look and do easier tasks such as stitching or dressing a wound, and also, if needed, send the person to the hospital. It's to help those who need medical care but not desperately enough to need to go to the emergency room. One night I was asked to go to an address and see an old lady that had fallen earlier that day and needed someone to check in on her since she lived alone. Easy enough, I thought. I was given the strangest directions to find the address, such as turn left when you see a stone that looks a bit like a badger. It's an understatement to say that this place was in the middle of nowhere. It took me almost an hour to get there, the snow and ice on the road making it more difficult. Normally, we work in pairs, but it was a busy night and this seemed like an easy job to do on your own, so my coworker and I decided to split to save time. As I approached the house, a small wooden cottage with no other houses in sight, I got the feeling I was being watched. If I had just trusted my instincts and turned around, it would have saved me so many problems, but I didn't. There was no doorbell, and the door was open, so I stepped inside shouting, "It's the nurse. I've come to see that you're doing okay, Mrs. K." There was no answer, and I couldn't find the light switch, so I took out my mobile phone and used it as a flashlight. The place smelled like cat urine and mold, and I wondered if the old lady hadn't heard me, and if I would scare her half to death showing up in the darkness of her home. Then suddenly I hear the door shut behind me, and instinctively knew it wasn't the old lady who had snuck up on me. "Please don't be scared, dear," I hear a woman's voice from somewhere close by. I turn around and see a man behind me, thin and tall, and with the haunted stare of an abstinent druggie. Fuck, I thought. I had been warned about things like this. It's common knowledge that we carry morphines and other goodies. I'll hand it over if it comes to that. Not worth fighting him for a few milliliters of morphine or steroid or whatever it is he wants. As calmly as I can, I look him in the eyes and say, "Is she your mother? I heard she had a fall today and I need to check her for signs of a concussion." With that, I spun around and went over to the old lady, looking scared and regretful, where she was curled up in the corner of a small sofa in the cold, dark kitchen. The man said nothing, but stared at me with hostile eyes as I grabbed my bag and got out the light I used to check pupils. I take my time examining her and try to come up with a plan of action. The man is blocking the only door out, In between him and myself there is a kitchen table, a large bread knife within his reach. I gasp for air and pretend to have noticed something wrong with the old lady. Please don't be alarmed, but I think I need to get you to the hospital tonight. I lied in my best good nurse voice. I planned to pretend to phone the ambulance, but instead phone the police. Then I turned to the man, pretending not to notice him staring at my bag, shaking with abstinence. Please come here and sit with your mother while I call the ambulance. No phone signal here, love. He smiles and comes closer, eyeing the knife on the table. I realize that it might take a long time before my coworkers start to miss me, and when she does, she won't know exactly where I am. If I was going to get out of this mess, I would have to come up with a solution myself. No one was coming to save me. Is he your son? I asked the woman. He takes my pain medicine for me, she sobs. And my pension. I'm sorry, he scares me. I look again at the bump on her forehead and realize that it's not from a fall, but from a punch. It seemed that the smartest thing to do was to give him all the drugs I had on me and hope he would be happy with that and let me go. But then, what if he feared I would call the cops now that I knew who he was? Give me your keys and the bag, he says, a sly smile dancing on his thin lips. No, I can give you something for abstinence, but then I need to go see my other patients. I'm running late, trying to make it sound like others were waiting for me to arrive. I don't think you will have any more patients tonight, he said. He was holding the knife in one hand, the sharp end up. He held it like he knew how to use it. People who threaten you with a knife, but have no experience using one, will often hold it high, but with the sharp point downwards. But if you know what you're doing and aim for maximum damage, you point it up. This was a red flag for me. Two thoughts ran through my mind at this point. He is a violent, unpredictable druggie and might want to kill me and the old lady. And I will fight with everything I've got, even if it's not that much. At that moment I throw over the bag, intentionally aiming for the corner, so he had to turn around to retrieve it. As he did, I took a few steps forward and kicked the knife out of his hands as hard as I could. I was wearing winter boots with spikes under them against the ice, and they ripped several small wounds on his hand. I then pushed my knee hard into his kidney and used both hands to force one of his arms up on his back. I was amazed at my own reaction. I'm not a violent man. The old lady cried, but didn't move from her corner and made no effort to stop me. Let me tell you one thing about my background. I live in Sweden, but my parents were immigrants, escaping the nightmares in Bosnia. In my childhood, I've seen horrible things and learned from a young age that there are situations in life when you have to fight to stay in the game. My dad had drilled all us kids in self-defense in Krav Maga, but I had never once used it before. The druggy guy tried to get up from under me and attempted to kick me, but didn't reach as I was sitting on his upper body. I realized that if he gets back up, my chances would be slim. So instead, I found the carotid artery and pushed. As he passed out, I grabbed the old lady and headed for the car, terrified that he might soon be waking up and give chase. As we reached the main road and got a signal on the mobile phone, I phoned the police and an ambulance to the address. The old woman said nothing during the ride into town. Later that night, a policeman came to my workplace to talk to me. It turned out that the druggie was well known to them. He had just served a sentence for killing a man, jumping on his head while he was out cold.
Number 10. I have a few paranormal events that happened all throughout my life. Most of them are pretty tame, but There is one that got to me and still sticks with me today. About 4 years ago, I was ending my freshman year at college. I had lived in the dorms with a kick-ass roommate and pretty much had a great experience altogether. Towards the end of my last semester, something seemed different in my hall of the dorms. We were all still our lively selves, but just walking into the dorms would give you this massive feeling of dread. We all wrote it off as the stress of finals approaching, but it just felt off. Well, one night after studying, I decided to hit the shower so I can just wake up and make my way to class in a few hours. Before I keep going, I should go ahead and set the layout of our hall and the bathroom. Our hall was one of many halls on a single floor. Each hall had 4 rooms that accommodated 2 people each. The entrance to the halls were massive steel doors with a small window located at one end, and across from it was the bathroom. It seriously felt like a prison block rather than a living quarter for college students. As for the bathroom itself, when you walked in, you were immediately met with 2 sets of sinks, 2 sinks to each side, on your left and your right, with massive mirrors facing each other, creating this infinite loop of mirrors. Then past that, you had your 2 urinals and a toilet stall on your left, and 2 showers on your right. When facing the left set of sinks, you can clearly see into the showers from the mirror if the door is open. And in the right set of sinks, you can see the reflection of the shower. The door of the bathroom was identical to the entrance to the hall. A massive steel frame with a small window that didn't allow for much of a view, and with good reason. The door was propped open with a giant wooden wedge that couldn't be moved unless you were really trying to close the door. So back to the story. I'm all alone in the bathroom gearing up to go shower. I throw my change of clothes on the right side sink so that way I can reach around the stall to grab them. Once I set my stuff down, I happened to look up into the mirror and I could see in the distance something almost shimmering inside the shower stall. As I look at it, I notice that it slowly gets closer, like it's jumping from the furthermost layer to the next layer closer. I'm kind of unsettled, but I don't think much of it other than me coming down off of a massive Red Bull, Adderall, and caffeine kick. But it starts transitioning faster. As it gets closer, I can start making out details, but nothing vivid or striking. It's just a dark mass that looks like it's covered in hair. At this point, I'm freaking out hardcore since this thing is getting closer in the mirror and I'm pretty much frozen to this one spot. As it gets to the 4th layer, I get the closest look at this thing I'll ever get, and I regret every minute of it. It wasn't hair, but some kind of long flowing veil. You could see through it partially, but from the torso down it was just solid black. And the face, I can't even describe the face. It was clearly human, but at the same time it was so far removed. There were eyes, they were black, but definitely glowing somehow. I only saw this for maybe a second at the most, but it's burned into my mind forever. Then the lights cut out and I hear the door slam. It's pitch black in the bathroom, so I can't see this thing anymore. I go to open the door, but it won't budge, and then this intense smell of blood hits me out of nowhere, and that's all I remember. I woke up later in the hospital. From what my RA claims, he was on his way to go use the bathroom sometime after this happened, where he found me in the shower stall with my shirt covered in blood from a massive nosebleed. He tried asking me what happened, and according to him, all I could respond with was, "It saw me," and I start freaking out. So he calls an ambulance and they get me to the hospital. All the while I'm apparently freaking out, so they sedate me to get me to calm down. I'm coming to around the time my parents show up. Worried sick, of course. I asked them what happened, and according to the doctors, they believe I had a seizure. However, they ran CAT scans soon after I was cooperative enough to do so, and they found no sign of any seizure occurring. Not to mention epilepsy doesn't run in my family at all. And having taken Adderall countless times in the past, and since then, I've never had a similar side effect, neither hallucinations or potential seizures. To this day, I still can't bring myself to look into a mirror for more than a minute, and just being stuck in a room with one for an extended period will cause me to break down. I've been to therapy going on 3 years because of this, and I've talked to countless religious leaders who, besides giving me the general, Well, you should turn to God in times like these, Talks. Don't recognize that kind of pattern as anything demonic or evil. And the strangest thing is that before that incident, there were no actual claims of any activity in those dorms. And since I left, there hasn't been any either. It was just that one isolated incident.
Number 9. When I was about 11, I had a steady babysitter named Jane. My brother and sister were 17 and 18, so they were either too cool to babysit me, or just busy with schoolwork. Jane was their age, but I don't think her family had a lot of money, so she would babysit me almost every weekend instead of doing normal teenager stuff. My family lived in a pretty well-to-do cul-de-sac in the back of a large neighborhood. It was one of those neighborhoods where the houses got nicer the further back you went. The houses at the front, by the main road, were not as nice, but not terrible or anything. This is where Jane lived. Since I was 11 and prepubescent, I was a huge pain in the arse. But not to Jane. I looked at her as a best friend. We did so many fun things together, and I could truly tell that Jane loved me. One Saturday night, my mum was making plans for the next week, but for the first time, Jane couldn't babysit. She had her first prom coming up. She was very excited because the boy she had had a crush on for years asked her. I knew because she had been telling me about him since she started high school. My mother and I were both very excited for her, and I saw my mum hand her way more money than usual. Jane's eyes teared up, and she gave us both a hug and left. Since this was the mid-90s, everyone got babysitters from word of mouth. My mum heard from another mother that a girl who used to babysit for her kids had just moved back to her parents' house after grad school. She lived down the street from Jane. Her name was Becky, and my mum called her up to see if she could babysit me that Saturday. Becky excitedly said yes, and proceeded to ask my mum somewhat strange, but not entirely alarming questions, like how tall I was, what I looked like, etc. There might have been other questions as well, but I was just hearing my mum's side of the conversation. When she hung up the phone, my mum said to my dad, "Whoa, she sure is thorough." I was a little nervous, as Jane had been the only one to babysit me for years. In the rare instances where she couldn't do it, my parents usually just cancelled their plans. But this was a work party, and my dad was being honoured, so that wasn't an option. A couple of days before Becky was due to come over, I begged my mum to call Jane. I wanted to see if I could go over to her house on the night of the prom and see her in her dress. My mum kept telling me that she wouldn't want me there, and that I could see pictures instead, but I insisted. So my mum called Jane, and handed the phone to me. "Hey there, May, how are you?" Jane said. "I'm good. I wanted to see if I could come over on Saturday and see you in your prom dress." She said, "Of course, I'm getting my hair done, but you can come over after that. Maybe at around 5:30? Tell your mum to call first and make sure I'm home." "Oh, it won't be my mum. It'll be Becky." Dead silence. Wait, what? "Oh, since you can't watch me, my mum found a girl named Becky to do it." There was a long pause. "Okay, sweetie, that's fine." She hurriedly got me off the phone. I went to school the next day, and came home to my mum hanging up the phone, shaking her head. Poor Jane. Her date doesn't want to take her anymore, and they had a fight. She wanted to know if she could still watch you this Saturday. I feel bad for cancelling on Becky, but it's completely up to you. Of course, I chose Jane. And as usual, we had tons of fun. I didn't bring up the prom because I didn't want to make her feel bad, but then she started asking me if I wanted to play dress up. We did each other's hair and put on my mum's dresses and took pictures with my mother's Polaroid. It was the best night of an 11-year-old's life. Jane went to community college, and by the time she went to a 4-year school, I no longer needed a babysitter. We kept in touch a little after that, but before long, we both got busy, and we lost touch. This was where the story ended, Until this past weekend. I ran into Jane at a bar. She was not sober. In fact, she was very drunk. She didn't seem to be doing well. She was very thin, and it looked like she had track marks on her arms. This made me extremely sad, because she was one of the people I love most in the world, at least at one time. I sat next to her at the bar, and I asked her how she was doing. Her face lit up, and she gave me a big hug. I always knew you would do well for yourself. Look at you. You're all grown up and beautiful. You look great too, Jane, I said. No, I don't. But it's okay. We started talking, and she was drinking even more. I got the feeling that she was in blackout drunk territory. She was with a group of people that seemed to be her friends, so I wasn't entirely worried for her. But I still didn't want to leave her alone for some reason. She seemed really happy to see me. We started reminiscing, and once it was my turn to bring up a story again, I said, "Remember when that dirtbag stood you up for prom, so we staged our own prom with pictures and everything? That was great." She looked at me through foggy eyes, and smiled, a small smile. He didn't stand me up. Your replacement babysitter was a sick fuck. When I was little, she beat me, sexually abused me, threatened me, and locked me in closets. Then she would invite her boyfriend over to do the same things to me. She told me if I ever told anyone, she would kill my family and I would have to live in an orphanage. She took pictures of me too. I'd repressed it until you said her name that day. Now it's all back. All of it. I should have told someone, but it's too late now. I just didn't want people to know what had happened to me. I regret so much that I didn't. Who knows what else she did. She set down her drink and gave me a huge hug and said, "Good to see you," like she hadn't just dropped a major bomb on me. She stumbled out with her boyfriend. Everything came flooding back to me. The phone conversation with Becky, with all the details. Jane's silence when I said Becky's name. How Jane stayed with me every single weekend until I was old enough to not need a babysitter. Some people might say Jane should have told someone, but she was just a kid. But she was an extraordinary kid. She gave up her prom to save me. She gave up every single weekend after that so nothing would ever happen to me. She was my guardian angel. Unfortunately, Jane didn't have her own Jane, and it makes me feel horrible.
Number 8. I live in a small town in New Hampshire. I'm a 16-year-old guy, and was going to see this show in the next town over, in the small town center. Like any normal small town in New England, brick buildings, abandoned mills, and lots of old people. I was sitting in the grass of the park, if you can even call it that, when I saw a man. Of course, he was old, like every other person here. He was alone, and staring at this little boy and his grandmother. Maybe he thinks she is good looking. They look to be about the same age. Then the little boy walks over to a tree right beside the stage, and the old man's eyes are following him. He's not breaking contact with the boy. About 15 minutes later, I get up to use the bathroom at a pizza place. As I'm leaving, I see that little boy all by himself, with a bit of terror in his eyes. Then I see him, the old man walking up fast from behind the little boy. I run over to him and ask him what was wrong, and he says he can't find his Grammy. Then the man says, "He's my grandson. I can take him from here." Then I said something stupid. "No, he's not. You've been staring him down for the past hour in the park." I've got my hands in my pocket, holding my knife that I always carry around, thinking I'm some sort of badass. The man says, "Okay then," and walks away. I thought that was weird. I would think he would have put up more of a fight. On the way home, I saw a silver Nissan Xterra following us all the way to my home, and then it drove by. I got nervous, but eventually forgot about it. That night, I was playing Xbox in my room, using only the TV and my cell phone as a light source, when I hear something from outside of my headphones. I hear someone trying to open my window. As I look at the two windows, I see it. The man from the park, staring at me with a crazy look. I reached over to my nightstand and grabbed the knife I have and showed it to him. He smiles and shows me a bigger knife, and now I'm scared. I tell my friends that if I'm not back in 2 minutes, to call the cops, and we just sat there and stared at each other. Then my dad walks in the room with his .38 revolver, asking if I've seen anyone lurking around the house. I point to the man at my window. My dad points it at him, and the guy loses his shit and blots out of my yard and up the street to his car, never to be seen again.
Number 7. I first met my friend Nick in middle school. At the time, we weren't really friends, but I did get to know him a little bit. Frankly, he scared me when I first met him. He was one of those kids who wore all black, gave himself piercings during class using safety pins, etc. He was bipolar and a whole slew of other issues, including being on drugs at the time too. Fast forward a few years to high school. I didn't really have any friends and was kind of a loner. I also have a full birthday, so I was one of the first kids in my class to turn 16 and get my license and start driving myself to school. Nick had grown out of the goth druggy phase, got on medication for his psychological problems, and seemed like a fairly normal guy now. One day, he was talking to me and asked if I could give him a ride home. I was happy to, since at the time I was pretty desperate for someone to hang out with. I ended up becoming very good friends with him and another guy he hung out with, and the three of us pretty much spent all of high school as a group. Looking back, they kind of took advantage of me, as my family had more money than either of theirs, and I was more than happy to share. I drove them to lunch and paid for it part of the time when they didn't have money, always had the newest video game systems, and would pay to rent games from Blockbuster. It was never anything major, just a few bucks here and there, and we really did have some good times. They were pretty good guys for the most part, but I do feel like that was at least part of the reason why they became my friends. Even if that was the case though, it was worth it for me, because they were literally the only bright spot in an otherwise miserable high school experience. Nick could sometimes be an asshole, particularly if you spent more than a day or so with him at a time. I took a week-long trip to the beach with his family and ended up hanging out with his brother more than him because he drove me insane. There was a particular incident at a go-kart track where he literally was screaming at a 10-year-old kid and trying to pick a fight with the kid's father after the race because he had cut him off on the track. He then got pissed at me for not backing him up when I was too busy trying to crawl in a corner and act like I didn't know him because he was being so ridiculous. I was embarrassed, and friend or not, I was kinda hoping the guy would kick his ass because he deserved it. After high school, Nick stayed in our hometown and went to a local community college while me and the other guy went to the state university a few hours away and were roommates. We would see Nick when he came home on weekends and stuff. After that year, he joined us. Nick struggled and was in and out of school, never really trying that hard. At one point, his girlfriend from high school cheated on him and he took it pretty hard. They started adjusting his medication, and I don't think they ever quite got it right because he was never the same again. During this time, I introduced him to my girlfriend's sister. We had actually gone to school with her, my girlfriend a couple of years younger, but never really knew her until I started dating her sister. Anyway, they started dating, and at first it was cool. We could double date and stuff. I was a little worried though because I knew he would be an asshole sometimes, and I was afraid of what would happen if their relationship went badly. Her parents hated him, and I was always trying to defend him as best as I could without making them hate me too. I had gotten engaged to my girlfriend, so I felt like I was always in the middle and in between my future in-laws and one of my best friends. Eventually, they got engaged too, which her parents really hated. They rushed into getting married. I think they'd been together for less than a year at the time, and moved in together while they were still in school. Things went south rather quickly. He started expecting her to support him, quit going to school, and said he was going to live on a disability for the rest of his life because of his issues, and they pretty much fought constantly. They had only been married for about 4 to 5 months when he started threatening to kill her. He even went as far as to detail the plans he had come up with to do it. Needless to say, she left, and they got divorced after less than a year. This put me in the awkward spot of having to choose between my fiancée and her family, or one of my only friends. I tried to defend him as best as I could, saying things like, "He's not really like that. His medication is still messed up. He doesn't mean it. He won't really do that." But how can you truly stick up for someone who's threatening to murder his wife? I did the best I could, but ultimately, if I wanted to keep my fiancée, I had to lose my friend. Our other friend was supposed to have been my best man, but he refused after what happened with Nick. So I ended up losing both of my friends over the ordeal. Pretty much exactly what I had been afraid of when they first started dating. The last time I spoke to Nick, he had come into the store I was working at with some people I'd never seen before. I said hey and waved, and he immediately flipped me off and walked out of the door. So that was pretty much confirmation that our friendship was completely over. I'm not really sure how any of this was my fault, but apparently I was supposed to completely leave a 6-year relationship and break off an engagement because he was a psychopath who threatened to kill her sister and she left him. I really wish this was the end of the story, but it continues. Her sister found someone new, who is an amazing guy and now one of the closest friends I've ever had. He ended up being my new best man, and I have far more in common with him than any of my old friends. He's been like a brother. I graduated, got married, moved home, and started a family. My now wife's sister got married to the new guy, and they have a 3-year-old together now. Everyone is happy, and we pretty much forgot Nick. Until the day he came back to town and started working at the local grocery store. My mother-in-law was the first one to see him and pretty much forbid her daughter from shopping there anymore. She was terrified that he would come after her or her kid if he saw them. They ended up moving to the other side of town shortly afterwards anyway, so not a big deal. I wasn't as threatened by him, so I continued to shop there. I assumed, since it had been about 5 years, that he'd move on with his life too. I would see him working a register or something and just go to a different one and try to avoid his notice. But other than that, I didn't really go out of my way to avoid him. One day, I saw him looking at me and sort of nodded. I didn't speak to him because of the way our last interaction had gone. I was met with the coldest stare I've ever seen. After that, anytime I was in the store, he would be there following me around. It was almost the way a store would have a worker shadow someone they think might be stealing. Whenever I looked up, he was nearby. When I left the store, he would head outside to bring carts in, or something, and watch me until I was in the car leaving. The last time I shopped there, I made the mistake of taking my newborn son. He started fussing, so of course I picked him up and tried to calm him down. At that point, Nick walked by and slammed into me, nearly making me drop my baby. He then walked off like nothing had happened. I decided that day that it would probably be best if I just started shopping at Walmart as much as I hated to. That still wasn't the end of it, unfortunately. A few nights later, I had stayed up late on the computer and realised I'd forgotten to sit the trash out to be picked up. It was about 3 AM when I went outside to move the cans to the curb. As I walked out of the garage, a large van with blacked out windows suddenly came down the street and just stopped at the end of the driveway. I was a little nervous since it was 3 AM and they were clearly not a neighbour. So I took my time fiddling with the cans beside the house, waiting to see what they were going to do. Eventually, they went slowly down the street and stopped. I put the cans out as fast as I could and went back inside. making sure all the doors were locked. I went to sleep with my gun on my nightstand. Also around this time, my grandmother's house was broken into. Whoever did it knew where everything in her house was because they didn't rummage through anything. They went straight to where her jewellery was and took most of it. Then they went straight to the closet where my grandfather's guns were and took several of them as well. About a week later, they returned and cleaned out what they hadn't taken the first time. We have no proof, so the cops won't do anything, but we're fairly certain it was Nick. He had been to her house before, and I had shown him the guns when we were friends. Since whoever broke in knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it, that pretty much limits the list of suspects. I've seen the van driving around in the front of the house late at night several more times since. It's becoming less frequent since I started shopping elsewhere, and thankfully, nothing else has happened. I keep my gun nearby at night now, and we've had a security system installed. Since nothing has actually happened, and since we can't prove he was the one who broke into my grandma's, the cops won't do anything. I'm hoping this doesn't escalate again.
In freshman year of middle school, there was a once-a-week group therapy session that involved them doing some crafts activities or playing with Legos or watching a movie as a group. It was half normal kids, half DD kids, and the normal kids could sign up for it. I signed up pretty instantly, as it meant an escape from history once a week. One of my best friends at the time had the same idea, and it basically turned into a second lunch period for us. The whole thing was overseen by a therapist named Bruce, and it was generally pretty laid back. Bruce was an overweight 50-ish balding guy, with the attitude and general appearance of Santa Claus. He ran most of the school's extracurriculars, and was pretty much universally liked. The other important player in this story was a kid who I'll call G. You know, that stereotype of psychopaths being obsessed with animal torture as a kid? This was dead on G. He'd regularly tell these long, excited stories during group about how much fun he had last week, tearing the leg off a squirrel he caught in his live trap, or other similar things. Most of us just sort of ignored him, as it was just sort of assumed that he was all talk and just making up gross stuff to get attention. So one week we were playing with Play-Doh. Since it was a DD group, the huge tub of Play-Doh had long since assumed a uniform shade of turd brown, and the general drive was to get people to build things and tell stories about them. Most people just built dinosaurs or threw clay at each other. G, for whatever reason, had a huge flat square slab laid out and was building 4 large pillars on the corners. He eventually put a roof on it, which wouldn't stay on due to the lack of interior supports. The normal kids would always leave a few minutes early as the group ran right into the start of the next period, and we'd need time to get to class. I was no different, and walked out while Bruce and the DD kids were smashing Play-Doh and throwing chunks of turd dough back into the bin. I got to my next class and the teacher wasn't there. Nobody knew what was going on. About 10 minutes later, she finally showed up, looking frazzled, and wouldn't give us any information other than something happened that needed staff attention. Being 6th graders, we went nuts with speculation. A few hours later, I ran into the friend from group, who was visibly jumpy and disturbed. He wouldn't tell me why, other than mentioning that therapy group was cancelled indefinitely. I kept prying for more information, and eventually got the story out of him. So during the cleanup, the Play-Doh had to be compacted back into its tub. This involved lots of smashed Play-Doh sculptures, a bit that the DD kids greatly enjoyed to the point where they'd try to smash other people's stuff. G's house was one of the last things to go. He smashed down 2 columns, let one of the DDs smash another, and finally dared Bruce to smash the last one. The last one, with a pocket knife in it. I never saw either Bruce or G ever again.
Number 5. I am male and was 22 when this story occurred. The encounter happened when I moved back to my hometown after graduating. At first, I had to move back in with my parents until I found a job. It was great at first, seeing more of my parents, as I hadn't seen them as much studying in a different city, but the novelty soon started to wear off as I was missing the independence I had living in my own apartment. I had gone for a few viewings that I had turned down as they weren't what I was looking for. This is when it happened. I came across an ad online for a place with a great location within my budget. The ad had contact details for Alan, with a standard-looking email address. I email Alan and find out the place is still available. I'm psyched and arrange for a viewing. Alan doesn't work or live in the town and won't be able to meet before 7:30 p.m. No problem, we can both do the next night. So I show up to the address. It looks just like the photos from the outside. I'm getting more and more excited and can't believe my luck. I knock on the door and a large man opens the door. I'm 6'1" and 190 pounds, and this guy was towering over me, easily 6'4". He almost looks disappointed as he extends his hand. "Hi, I'm Andy," he says. His name was Alan on the ad. It wasn't a red flag yet, it could just be he doesn't like advertising his real name. As I shake his hand and say I'm, insert my name here, he responds, "I thought you'd be a girl." I have a unisex name. I, at this point, am assuming he prefers girls as they tend to be considered as tidier than guys. I say, "Don't worry, I'm quite OCD with my living space. I like to keep it clean." He just kind of nods, still looking disappointed, but as if he's trying to hide it. He uninterestedly shows me around the place. I actually really love it so far, but anytime I show my interest, he seems to be trying to put me off. For example, I said I loved the big windows and he responds with telling me they can be drafty. Just things like that. I'm still brushing this off as him thinking I won't be as clean as a female tenant would. We finish looking around the place and I tell him I'm really interested in renting but first want to see the basement. It was advertised with spacious basement in the listing. He says that there is no basement. I just look at him confused and point out that it says so on the ad, and there's a door in the apartment he didn't open during the tour, which I'm assuming is the basement entrance. He's beginning to act a bit sketch and says that he's reconsidering including the basement and he's going to use it for storage instead. The basement was a big positive for me on the ad as I pictured man caving it or throwing parties down there with some friends. This place was really in my budget, and I say I would really like to see the basement, and if I liked it we could possibly work something out, like me paying more to include the space with the rent. He seems unsure, but as I'm being adamant, he finally relents and says he will show me, but first he has to go down and tidy up before he can show me. At this point I'm reconsidering hanging around as this seems like a red flag, but at the same time, he did say he was going to use it for storage instead, so I figure maybe it is a bit untidy. I decide to wait. Andy disappears into the dark basement. I'm waiting for the light to flicker on when he reaches the bottom of the stairs, but it stays dark. I hear some shuffling around for a minute or so, and then the light comes on and he shouts up that I can go down. I begin to get a really uneasy feeling and I'm considering leaving, but I brush it off because I do still really like the apartment. I head down the stairs and I reach the turn in the stairs near the bottom when Andy perks up. "Watch your feet." That's when I look down and I notice it. There's a thin line of that plastic kind of clear wire stretched across the stairs. You know, the kind that is used for washing lines. It runs across about ankle height right before the bend and is tied round at the ends and secured by screws. He sees the "what the fuck" look on my face and quickly chimes in that the last tenant had a dog and he painted models or something down there. The wire was there to keep the dog out and he hasn't had a chance to remove it yet. Pretty flimsy excuse considering the ad said no pets. I'm thinking the only reason he didn't remove it was because I was at the top of the stairs and would have seen. Obviously at this point alarm bells are ringing, so I don't wander far from the bottom of the stairs. Andy says, "Well, here it is," and a minute later is quickly trying to rush me back up the stairs. Relieved, all I see down there is boxes and a tied-up bin liner. Typical storage stuff, no weird smell or anything, just a normal-looking basement. And then I notice it just as I turn to go back upstairs. An old mattress poorly propped up in the far corner. It has a sheet covering it, but you can see the bottom corner and it's clear on what it is. It looked like he tried to hide it with a sheet, but couldn't see in the dark. We head back up the stairs, me leading, and I remember to step over the wire. Andy immediately closes the door when we're back up and says, "Well, get in touch if you want the place and maybe we can work something out with the basement." He's acting super sketchy at this point and I could tell he wants me out right away. So I say, "Sure, it's a lovely place. I'll be in touch. Nice meeting you." I'm quickly ushered out. I called my best friend when I left and told him what happened. I told him that I'm worried Andy is planning on luring a girl down there and tripping her on the stairs to do God knows what. He says maybe I'm being paranoid, but it does sound sketchy. I decide better safe than sorry and call the police station on the non-emergency number that night, and I explain what happened. The police thank me and say they'll check it out, but they don't sound very sincere. I expect to hear a follow-up. Nothing. I call back a week later to inquire and I'm told they can't release any information. I keep an eye on the local news and nothing comes up that sounds like Andy. The ad did get removed the next day though. Maybe I put him off the idea. Maybe it was me being paranoid and there was nothing malicious going on. Or maybe Andy followed through with this plan and was never caught.
Number 4. Keep in mind that I am unsure of the exact age I was during this series of events, but it took place over a majority of my life thus far, and promptly ended in 2011 when I was about 11 years old. I remember most of these things happening, and my mum has filled me in on some of the details since. I live in a good neighborhood, in a good city. It was being built when we moved here, but I always remember these two being my neighbors. Their names were Betty and Jeff. The first interaction I remember having with either of them was when Betty gave my sister and I a whole bunch of McDonald's toys. You know how they display every one of those toys inside? We got one of those displays. I was 5, and my sister was 2, and I remember being ecstatic, as any younger child would be. My mum later informed me that Betty would tell her that we were the cutest kids in the world, and that she wished she had children like us. Flash forward a few years later, where I'm guessing I was about 7 or 8. I was hanging out with another girl my age, who was also my neighbor from down the street. We left my house, and we were walking to hers. When we got outside, we saw Betty throwing a bunch of Jeff's shit out of the second-story window. I vividly remember her screaming profanities as she tossed an old TV set out of the window, and smelling cologne that she must have thrown out as well. My friend and I rushed to get inside, and just thought that she was crazy. Between the age of 8 and 10, Betty and Jeff must have had a few more fights. There's nothing that I can remember, but I do remember my mum telling me that Betty confronted my dad. My dad had been outside doing yard work at about 8:30 or 9 p.m. It was summertime, so the sun was still out, and kids were still outside, yelling and playing. All of a sudden, Betty marched out of her house and straight to my dad. She yelled at him for keeping everybody awake with the sound of a leaf blower, and probably called him a motherfucker a few times as well. I would understand her anger more if it was dark outside, but it still kind of confuses me. Maybe she had a right to be angry. One day, when I was 10, I had returned home from school to the sight of police cars and a bunch of yellow caution tape surrounding Betty and Jeff's house. I ran inside and asked my mum what had happened, and she had no clue. She later found out from my other neighbor that Betty had died, possibly being thrown down the stairs or something like that. They were trying to figure out if it was self-inflicted, or if Jeff had finally lost his shit and killed her. A few days later, I was outside by myself drawing with chalk. As soon as I got outside, I saw Jeff walk over to his glass door. He hadn't been arrested for anything yet, and was presumed innocent. I thought I had nothing to worry about, so I continued on and retrieved my chalk from the garage. I began to draw, when I noticed that Jeff was staring out of his door, directly at me. This continued for 10 minutes. I eventually got creeped the fuck out and went to tell my dad. By the time he came outside with me, Jeff had left the door. That's when I realized that maybe Jeff was the batshit crazy one. In April 2011, Jeff was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 30 years. Turns out, he gave Betty a fatal dose of antifreeze, and I'm still unsure whether or not he pushed her drugged and dead body down the stairs for good measure. After reading an article on it, Betty claimed that Jeff was very abusive and would not let her do anything without his permission. That would explain her behavior, but I'm still not completely convinced that she was entirely innocent either. A new couple has since moved into their house. They're completely normal from what I can tell, knock on wood, and we haven't had any murderous events happen on my street since.
Number 3. I just remembered the most creepy thing ever, with photographic proof. I was catching the last train back from London, and had about an hour to kill at a station where I needed to change. It was late at night, I was on my own, and the station didn't have many people in it. I decided that this was a great time to have a little wander around the platforms, stretch my legs a tad, and enjoy the wait. I ended up walking down a platform with no more scheduled journeys for the night, so naturally, there were very few of us there. Actually, there were just 2 of us, me and a little girl. It's quite unusual to see a little girl standing on her own in the dead of night, and I'm not sure if I did the right thing or not, but I stopped walking, parked myself on a bench about 20 meters away, and decided to subtly keep an eye on her to make sure she was okay. At first, I assumed her mother had probably gone to the toilet or something, and asked her to stay in the same place until her return, but children shouldn't be on their own like that. So I sat there, and decided to be a temporary guardian for her. This girl was standing down the platform, and appeared to be about 10 years old or so, in her school uniform. From what I could tell, she was Asian, and seemed pretty confident standing where she was. Very, very still. Because after 5 minutes passed, this little girl was still standing in the exact same position that she was before. I mean, I hadn't seen her move an inch. I sat there on the bench, thinking about what could have happened. Had her mother told her to stand there, and then abandoned her? Had she been separated from her carer? Maybe I should wait a bit longer. And she just stood there, in the same position, right arm clutched to her body, staring directly at me. 10 minutes passed. 15. It was winter, and the platforms were cold. This little girl must have been absolutely freezing, but she was just standing there, staring at me. I could feel her eyes burning into my soul. Was she angry? Was I hallucinating? I considered going to find help, but then a cleaner walked past her. He didn't even look at her. He just swept past and skipped on his merry way. He wouldn't just let a child stand there, right? Was she a ghost? If I got up to get help, then I would have to take my eyes off the girl. And then what if she ran away? What if some creep snatched her? No. Her safety was important. 20 minutes. It was getting ridiculous. This little girl had been abandoned or something. I decided that when 25 minutes passed, if nothing had happened, I'd hop up and go ask her if she was okay. I don't know why I didn't do it sooner, but I was hoping her parents would come collect her or something. As long as I kept a lookout for the girl, everything would be okay. 22 minutes passed, and she was still standing there, staring at me from a distance. I needed to take a picture and send it to someone to make sure that I wasn't seeing things. Like a sleepy hallucination, or a psychotic break, or something. Because this apparently invisible ghost demon child is just standing there casually glaring in my direction. I shit you not. I sent it to my friend at the time for confirmation. No, I wasn't seeing things. I wasn't dreaming. I needed to go help her. And 25 minutes later, she still stood there, dead still, staring at me, in the freezing cold, in the dead of night. Just me and her, here on this dark and creepy platform. I stood up tentatively and walked towards her. I got a bit closer, and she stood there, remaining still. Now as I got closer, it was probably the most oh my god moment I've ever experienced. I saw her face, the shadows hitting it under the dim station lights. It looked half melted, like she had no real eyes. My heart was pumping faster and faster and faster. I couldn't stop now. This poor girl was probably a victim of a horrific accident, and definitely not a demon. Just because she stood so still for so long in the cold weather and stared at me. Well, I guess maybe she didn't stare at me. She didn't have eyes. Wait, what if she actually is a ghost? Is this my last moment on this planet? No, don't be stupid. She's just a poor little girl. I was scared, I admit, but I knew that this girl with a melted face needed someone's help. I needed to go ask if she was okay. Besides, what kind of person would I be if I just left her there? As I got closer, it just became more clear. She was deformed, abandoned, a poor little girl. But I couldn't help but be scared. But I powered through it. I walked up closer to her, opened my mouth to ask her something, trembling, and I couldn't believe what I saw. She was made of Legos. She was a goddamn art installation made of Legos. Just standing there, being creepy, staring at people, and being made of Legos.
Number 2. This happened to me when I was a young boy. I'm now in my late 50s, and I haven't thought about being 10 years old in a long time. My youngest kid told me about this website a while back, so I thought you all might like to hear this story of someone I would never want to meet again. I remember it being around my 10th birthday when everything changed in my life for my family. I remember it being the best birthday yet, because my mum had secretly saved up enough money to buy me my own bicycle, and I was more than thrilled. No more borrowing my older brother's when he let me, or standing on the back or sitting on the handlebars of a friend's bike. We were by no means well off when I was young. We didn't have much, so getting that bike had meant a lot to me. My father was a man who worked a lot and drank even more than he worked. I'm pretty sure he was drunk more than he was ever sober, and because of that, he was hardly around. That was okay with me, my siblings, and my mother for the most part. Things were actually nice and peaceful when he wasn't at home, and the nights he did actually come home, we knew right away to steer clear of him, be quiet, and leave him alone. We lived outside of a small town, down a long dirt road with not very many neighbours nearby. The closest one was a good mile down from us, a really big farmhouse with lots of fields. I remember being friends with their kids, as they were around the same age as us, and we went to school together. Their mum was very sweet, and always offered us something to eat or drink when we would stop down there. And their dad, well, he was the complete opposite of our father. I never saw him drink, or yell, or slap them, or their mum around. We knew that not every family was like ours, and that some fathers out there actually seemed to care for them. Like I said, I remember it being around my 10th birthday because my mum had baked a big cake for myself, my brother, and my 2 younger sisters to share, and of course, she had come too. Then, she took me out back where she had hidden the bike from me in one of the sheds, and I remember screaming with excitement, hugging and kissing her, telling her I loved her and that she was the greatest mum ever. I hopped on right away and took off up and down the road to test it out. It was a great feeling, that moment. When something so great happens, you kind of forget the regular hell life you seem to live every other day. It's hard to explain, I guess. Things were good for the next couple of days. My father had not really been home for almost a week, probably at that point. Sometimes he would just stop in for a few moments here or there. I guess just to check up to make sure my mum hadn't left him or something. When I was that age, I hardly recall any point in time when he was home for more than 1 or 2 nights in a week, and never 2 nights in a row. We, the kids, never knew what he was doing, nor did we really want to know. We just knew it was better at home when he wasn't there. I remember riding my bike down the dirt road, on my way home from running into town to pick up something at the grocery store for my mum, when my dad's pickup truck passed me and kept heading on down toward home. It made me want to not even go back home, but really, what else could I do? The sun was just starting to go down, and normally if he did come home, it was night after work, or very late at night after he left who knows where. So it was kind of odd he was on his way home at this time of day. By the time I pulled up into the yard, I could already hear the yelling. I could hear my mum's voice, trying to reason with him for something or other, and then I would hear my dad's voice just overpower hers. I heard something smash. I didn't want to go inside. I could hear my little sisters bawling, and then I heard my mum crying too. My older brother just happened to be down at the neighbour's place that had the farmhouse. I really didn't want to go inside at this point. I heard another smash. I decided to go in because I couldn't leave my mum and sisters in there alone with him. I peeked in the window of the door before I actually walked in and saw the house getting destroyed right in front of my family by my crazy drunk father. I tried opening the door slightly and getting my sister's attention to come out, but my dad saw and went from focusing on them to me. I blocked a lot of this out, but from what I can remember, he turned, went straight for me, picked me up by my shoulders, and started screaming in my face. My mum was behind him, begging him to put me down, but he just turned and gave her another slap in the face, and she backed down. From what I could tell that was coming out of him, he was livid when he saw me riding down the road on my bike he knew wasn't my brother's. When he got home, he confronted my mum on where it came from and how I was on it. He got out of her that she had secretly been stashing away money to save up to get me the bike, and my dad lost it when she told him that. I'm sure he was probably on a 5 or 6 day heavy drinking binge at this point, because I remember the smell of his breath was like sour whiskey pouring into my nostrils as he screamed at me. He was sure that my mother was hiding other things from him, and he was going to find out what. That is why he started tearing up the house. In the 5 minutes it took from him passing me on the road until I got there, he had done quite a bit. All the furniture was thrown around, lamps and pictures had been smashed. He threw me against one of the walls as I looked up from the floor. He had stormed into the kitchen and smashed what was left of my birthday cake against the back door. Both my sisters were huddled in the corner holding each other while my mum cried and had blood running down her face. That was it for me. This was the worst I'd ever seen my father, and I was scared. I ran out of the house, hopped on my bike and started heading towards the neighbours. We did not have a telephone at the time, but I knew they did, and I was going to call the police in town and stop him. I hardly got out of the driveway when I heard the front door open and heard my father yelling to get my ass back there. I just kept on pedaling, thinking I needed to get to the neighbours and everything would be better. That's when I heard his truck start up, and I looked behind me as he was backing out of the driveway and started heading towards me. I could see the neighbour's house in the distance and just kept on pedaling until I started to see the headlights getting closer and closer. I looked behind me. He was so close I knew he was going to hit me. I remember just jumping off the bike towards the side of the road and tumbling down into the side of the field. I shot up and just started running across the field towards the neighbours, hearing my dad yelling but not really caring. When I looked behind me, I saw that my father had already turned around and was heading back towards our house. I got to the neighbours a few minutes later and pounded on the door. Their mum opened the door and took a step back because at this point I was sobbing, shaking, and probably didn't look like my normal self. She took me inside and called her husband to get in here. I was in the middle of telling them what happened when my brother and his friend walked in from playing out back, and in about 2 seconds he was out the door and heading towards home. The mum called the police in town, and they said they would send someone out right away. About 10 minutes had passed, and no police had shown up, so I begged the husband to please drive me down to my house. I didn't know what was happening, and I was scared. He agreed, since he knew my little sisters and mum were there. About halfway down the road, we passed my bike. It was completely mangled up. My dad had run it over with his truck. I started crying again, partly because I loved that bike and mostly because I could have still been on it when he did that. We get to the house and my father's truck is gone. Apparently, my brother ran all the way home, picked up a baseball bat that was on the side of the house with no hesitation, walked in the living room and smashed my dad's kneecap in. As he laid there screaming, my brother grabbed my sisters and mother and ran into one of the bedrooms. He managed to crawl out to his truck and drive away though. The cops showed up just a few minutes after the neighbour and I arrived and took a look at everything that had happened. They found my father about an hour later, one town over at the local tavern. Said it wasn't very hard to find him since he was a well-known drunk in the area and the bars were the first places they were going to look for him. They arrested him pretty much on the spot. That night, after the police found my father, the neighbours invited us to stay with them for however long we needed to. My mum was embarrassed, but so very thankful for their help. We only stayed a couple of days, enough time for my mum to make arrangements to leave that town and go live with my aunt, her sister, for a while and a couple of 100 miles away from where we lived. I never did see my father again after that, and I have never really minded that. I know he wasn't in jail too long because shortly after we got settled in my aunt's house is when the phone calls and letters started. But my mum never caved and went back. I mean, who would? After a year or so, he gave up and agreed to a divorce. I never really paid much attention to that, as I was still young and was living a different life than I had before. We stayed with my aunt for a couple of years until my mum saved up enough money after getting a job to get our own place. At that point, my brother was 16 or 17, so he was also helping bring in money from his job, as well as myself with a newspaper route. I even saved up enough money to get myself another bike. Life was better then, better than it had ever been.
I love to ride my bike along country roads. Not far from where I live is a tiny town called 3 Oaks in Michigan. One Saturday, my wife was working and I had nothing to do, so I strapped my bike to my car and drove the hour to 3 Oaks. I parked in the scenic downtown area and then rode out of the town and into the surrounding countryside. As I wound my way further into the remote countryside, houses and businesses and cars grew increasingly scarce. Eventually, there were only an occasional house or two every half mile or mile, and cornfields and small woods flanking the dirt and gravel roads that I pedaled down. It's on one of those back roads that a minivan drove past me. Within moments of it passing, it turned around and pulled up alongside me. I looked over in the passenger. A woman in her mid to late 20s was looking at me with her window down. The driver, a man of seemingly the same age, leaned over the passenger and said to me in a slight southern drawl and with a big smile on his face, "Hey, do you know David Christ?" I thought for a brief second, but I don't know any David Christ, so I said no. The driver said, "You don't know him at all?" I said that I didn't and apologized, and then pedaled on. The van sat for a moment longer, then pulled a U-turn and drove off in the direction it was originally heading. I thought nothing of the encounter. Maybe the driver was a friend of David Christ, and he thought we had met David or something. I don't know. At the time, I didn't think I had any reason to worry. I continued my ride, turning down this road and heading north, and then turning down that road and heading east. I didn't have any agenda. I was just out to enjoy the summer day. Maybe 10 minutes later, and on an entirely new road and heading an entirely different direction from the one I had first met the van, I saw the van again. We were heading toward each other, and I gave a smile and a nod as I passed the driver. I remember thinking it was an odd coincidence that I should come across this van again. The driver stared as he passed, and he had a big smile on his face. At this point, I began wondering what they were doing. They might be lost in looking for this David Christ guy. Or maybe they're just enjoying a scenic drive and thought I looked like a friend of a friend, or something. I didn't know, but at that point, I was starting to think about the situation a little more critically. I continued, taking a twisting, turning, meandering path, taking this road and then turning onto that, heading north, south, west, east. Then, I came across the van again. Again, they're heading in my direction, and I pulled alongside them. The driver rolled down his window and leaned out. He was a late 20s white man with a few inches of goatee and a baseball cap. He had a large smile plastered across his face again. I stopped my bike and looked at him, waiting for him to say something, and he just looked at me for a good 30 seconds. Now, 30 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but you go flag down a stranger and then just look at them for 30 seconds and you'll realize that in that kind of situation, 30 seconds is a lifetime. Finally, he spoke and said, "Hey, do you know David Christ?" Same damn question. This time there was no smile on his face. He stared at me and I was thinking to myself, is he joking? Does he really not remember he asked me the same question 20 minutes ago? Is he just being funny? Is he high as hell? After a moment, I told him that I still didn't know anyone by the name of David Christ, and I pedaled off down the road. It's at that time that I realized exactly in how remote of an area I was. I peered down the road I was on, and I didn't see a house on its entire length. I was flanked by a cornfield on one side and a forest on the other. I looked over my shoulder and saw the van slowly driving down the road away from me. It couldn't be a coincidence that I came across this van 3 times now, not with me taking random roads heading different directions. It made no sense why anyone driving would take that same maze of roads. The only thing they could have been doing was just driving around. Maybe a pleasure drive, but why would they stop and ask that same question twice? It was quite strange, and I was beginning to become a little concerned. I decided to begin to head back toward the town center. I pedaled hard, and the gravel road ahead of me continued with a bend to the right and a dirt path, for it couldn't really be called a road to the left. As I neared the fork, who should come around the bend but that damned van? I gripped my pocket knife, which I always take with me on rides like this, just in case, and then realized all they would have to do is run me down with the van, and I would be in serious trouble. As the van drew closer, I was ready to jump off and run into the cornfields. The van slowed down as it approached me, and the driver rolled down his window and leaned out again. But this time, I didn't stop riding. I increased my speed, even though I knew I could never outrun the van if they gave chase. I looked over my shoulder and saw the van sitting in the middle of the road. I took the right fork and continued on the gravel road until I could no longer see the van behind the corn rows, and then I stopped. I got off my bike and crept along the cornfield until I was at its edge, and I peeked down the road I had just been on. The van was in the distance, driving away from me. I ran back to my bike, and then as soon as the van was entirely out of sight, I turned around and took the left fork along the dirt path. I rode as fast as I could, knowing that if the people in the van had nefarious things in mind, and if they caught me, flanked by cornfields and far from an area that anyone would come across us, that would be the time they attacked. My ruse worked. Or perhaps the van was never after me at all, and I made it the rest of the way to the town center without seeing them again. When I got home later that day, I was still replaying the events in my head, and the name David Christ kept creeping through my mind. Was David Christ someone famous, I wondered? Like a musician? Should I have known David Christ? I decided to Google the name. I tried a couple of different spellings for Christ, but it's the C-R-I-S-T spelling that revealed a terrifying result. I came across a newspaper article from Knoxville, Tennessee. The article explained how a man named David Christ had turned himself in after stabbing another man at a gas station in 2013. The article included a photo of this criminal, David Christ, and I believe it was the same man driving the van. Add a baseball cap and a few inches of goatee, and the man in the van was a dead ringer for David Christ in the article. I did an inmate search of the Knox County Prison, and there was no David Christ in the inmate population. Somehow, David Christ had gotten out of prison, or maybe he was never convicted, as I couldn't find any articles about sentencing. In less than 2 years after stabbing a guy, and for some reason, he had made his way to Michigan. Why was he driving along these back roads? Who was the woman in the passenger seat? And why the hell did he keep asking if I knew him? Do I know David Christ? Yes, I do now.
Got an idea for a top 15 list? Submit it at top15s.net/submit. Be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thanks for watching.